June 18, 1944. The Normandy coast no longer looks like a battlefield. The smoke of the landing still hangs faintly in the air, but something else now dominates the horizon. Steel, wood, motion. Floating roads stretch across the sea. Ships queue patiently bow to stern as if waiting their turn in an industrial procession. Cranes swing overhead. Trucks roll forward without pause. Fuel lines snake across sand once soaked with blood. From the bluffs above, German observers watch in silence. This is not chaos. This is not improvisation. This is organization on a scale they have never seen. Only days earlier, German commanders had believed the Americans would stall, bogged down by narrow beaches, shattered ports, and fragile supply lines. Europe had taught them that wars were won by speed, maneuver, and iron discipline. Logistics was secondary, a supporting act. Now every hour, thousands of tons of supplies come ashore without a functioning harbor. Ammunition, food, fuel, vehicles, spare parts, entire hospitals in crates. The realization comes slowly, then all at once. This invasion is not just an army landing. It is an entire industrial civilization stepping onto the continent, and once it starts moving inland, nothing in Europe will be able to stop it. Because to understand what is unfolding on these beaches, we must first understand why Germany never believed this was possible. By the summer of 1944, Germany had been at war for nearly 5 years. And for most of that time, victory had come through speed. The German way of war was built on movement. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Tanks broke through, infantry followed, aircraft paralyzed the enemy's rear. The goal was collapse, not attrition. Wars were meant to be short, decisive, and resolved before supply shortages could matter. In Poland, in France, in the early stages of the Soviet invasion, it had worked. German logistics reflected this belief. Railways were the backbone of the Wehrmacht. Supplies flowed forward in carefully scheduled trains, feeding fast-moving spearheads. Fuel dumps were temporary. Ammunition stocks were calculated tightly. There was no room nor patience for excess. To German planners, logistics was an art of efficiency, not abundance. This worldview shaped how Germany judged its enemies. Britain was an island power dependent on shipping, vulnerable to blockade. The Soviet Union had manpower but poor infrastructure. And the United States was distant, inexperienced, and in German eyes, industrially clumsy. American soldiers were often dismissed as over-equipped, their commanders as cautious, their society as soft. German intelligence reports before 1941 consistently underestimated America's ability to wage sustained land warfare in Europe. Yes, the United States could produce weapons, but production alone did not win wars. Weapons had to be moved, fed, fueled, repaired across oceans, through ports, along roads under fire. And Europe, the Germans believed, would break American logistics long before American industry could matter. This belief hardened after 1942. The failed deep raid reinforced German confidence in the Atlantic Wall. If the Allies could not even hold a French port for a day, how could they supply an entire army? German planners assumed any future invasion would hinge on capturing a deepwater harbor intact, something they were determined to prevent. Ports were fortified, bridges were wired with explosives, rail yards were marked for demolition. The coastline became a maze of concrete, steel, and pre-registered artillery fire. To the German mind, the problem was solved. Without ports, the Allies would starve on the beaches. Meanwhile, Germany's own logistical situation was deteriorating. By 1943, the war had become one of attrition, the very kind Germany had never planned to fight. Allied bombing campaigns targeted rail networks, fuel plants, and factories. The Eastern Front devoured men and material at an unprecedented rate. Fuel shortages became chronic. Trains ran less frequently. Trucks sat idle for lack of spare parts. Yet even then, German leadership clung to familiar assumptions. They believed that logistics constrained everyone equally, that supply lines were a weakness to be protected, not a weapon to be wielded, and that no army, no matter how rich, could simply overwhelm Europe with material. What they failed to understand was that the United States was not preparing to fight Europe's kind of war. It was preparing to change the rules. Across the Atlantic, American planners were thinking in terms unfamiliar to European officers. Not divisions, but tonnage, not weeks, but months of sustained flow, not ports, but alternatives. They were not asking how to supply an army once it landed. They were asking how to land the supply system itself. By late 1943, the invasion of Western Europe was no longer framed as a military gamble, but as a mathematical problem. How many tons per day would be required? How many ships? How many trucks? How many pipelines, cranes, depots, repair units? Every answer pointed toward an uncomfortable truth. If the invasion succeeded, it would not be because of tactical brilliance alone, but because of something far less dramatic and far more powerful. logistics on an industrial scale. And as these calculations hardened into plans, a second reality emerged, one that Germany had never fully grasped. America was not mobilizing an army, it was mobilizing an entire economy for war. And that economy was about to cross the ocean. By early 1944, the war had entered a phase no European power had ever experienced. The United States was no longer preparing for war. It was executing a system. American industrial mobilization had begun in earnest after December 1941, but by 1943 it reached a scale that defied historical comparison. Civilian factories were converted almost overnight. Automobile plants produced tanks, refrigerator lines assembled machine guns, shipyards launched vessels faster than Germany could sink them. This was not improvisation, it was central planning fused with private industry. The War Production Board coordinated raw materials. The Army Service Forces tracked every crate, every barrel of fuel, every spare part. Logistics was no longer a supporting branch, it was elevated to a strategic weapon. At the center of this effort stood men rarely remembered in popular war narratives. Engineers, quartermasters, transportation officers, statistical planners. Their task was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Move an entire mechanized army across an ocean and keep it fed, fueled, and armed under fire. Operation Overlord forced a brutal realization. No major French port could be relied upon. Cherbourg might fall, but it would be sabotaged. Le Havre, Brest, and Antwerp were distant or heavily defended. The Germans would destroy docks, cranes, and rail links the moment they retreated. So the Americans and their British allies did something unprecedented. They decided to bring the ports with them. The solution took form as the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports assembled from prefabricated concrete caissons, floating roadways, and steel piers. Built in secrecy in Britain, these structures were designed to be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the beaches within days of the landings. To European military thinkers, the idea bordered on madness. But American planners saw it differently. If logistics could not depend on terrain, terrain would be engineered to serve logistics. The same logic drove another quiet innovation. Fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, would not be hauled solely by tanker trucks. A pipeline would be laid under the sea. The project was codenamed Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean. Its purpose was blunt. Ensure that Allied forces would never outrun their fuel supply. Behind these headline innovations lay a web of less visible systems. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in relentless waves. Standardized cargo packaging allowed supplies to be unloaded quickly under fire. Repair units were trained not to fight but to fix vehicles, weapons, roads, and bridges. Entire divisions were dedicated to transportation alone. Perhaps most crucially, American logistics embraced excess. European armies optimized for efficiency. The Americans optimized for continuity. Redundancy was not waste, it was insurance. If one route failed, another would absorb the flow. If one depot was bombed, three more stood ready. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this better than most. As Supreme Allied Commander, he did not see logistics as a background function. He saw it as the foundation of every operational decision. Advances would not be planned around enemy weakness alone, but around supply capacity. This mindset baffled many German analysts. To them, the invasion force looked bloated. Oversupplied, slow. They believed such an army would collapse under its own weight once confined to the narrow Norman countryside. They did not grasp that weight was the point. By June 1944, more than 2 million Allied personnel were staged in Britain. Thousands of ships waited in port. Millions of tons of supplies were already packed, labeled, and scheduled. Every crate had a destination. Every vehicle had a route. Every day after D-Day had been calculated in advance. What the Germans saw as overconfidence was, in reality, preparation on a continental scale. When Allied troops hit the beaches, they would not be fighting alone. Behind them would come a river of material, unceasing, adaptable, and indifferent to losses. The invasion would not hinge on one breakthrough. It would hinge on whether Germany could survive being slowly, relentlessly buried under weight. And as the first ships turned toward Normandy, that question was no longer theoretical. It was about to be tested, hour by hour, ton by ton. The story of Normandy's logistics does not begin with generals. It begins with labor. On the beaches far from the front lines, men worked without headlines or medals, dockworkers in uniform, engineers with grease-stained hands. Truck drivers who would drive farther in a single day than many infantrymen would march in a month. They worked under fire. German artillery still reached the beaches. Luftwaffe raids, though weakened, struck at night. Mines drifted in the surf. And yet the unloading never stopped. Supplies were manhandled off landing craft, vehicles were coaxed through soft sand, crates were stacked, sorted, and moved again within minutes. There were no dramatic charges here, no flags raised. Only rhythm. A truck rolled in. A truck rolled out, over and over, day and night. These men understood something instinctively. Every delay at the beach was a delay at the front. Every missed delivery could mean a stalled advance or lives lost miles inland. Exhaustion was constant. Sleep came in fragments, yet the system absorbed human limits the same way it absorbed losses by redundancy. Another driver. Another crew, another shift. The machine did not depend on heroes. It depended on replacement. For the first time in modern war, supply was not reacting to combat. It was shaping it. American commanders did not simply ask where the enemy was weakest. They asked where the supply lines could follow. Roads were selected not for elegance but for load-bearing capacity. Advances were paused not because of enemy resistance, but because depots had not yet caught up. This restraint frustrated some frontline officers. They wanted speed, momentum, exploitation. But the lesson of North Africa and Italy had been learned. A rapid advance without supply was an illusion. Tanks without fuel were immobile targets. Infantry without ammunition was exposed flesh. So the advance in Normandy became deliberate. Every mile forward was anchored by supply points. Every push was measured against tonnage delivered per day. Artillery fire plans expanded not because of boldness, but because shells were available in abundance. This was warfare by assurance. German units trained to strike fast and live lean found themselves at a disadvantage. Their counterattacks depended on fuel they no longer had. Their artillery rationed shells. Their movement was constrained not by terrain but by absence. The battlefield was no longer symmetrical. One side counted bullets, the other counted time. From the German perspective, the invasion defied logic. Intelligence officers reported staggering numbers. Thousands of vehicles landing daily, artificial harbors rising from the sea, supply dumps expanding instead of shrinking. Reports reached higher command, but the scale was difficult to believe. German doctrine had never accounted for this. Their war economy was designed for efficiency under scarcity. Railways ran on schedules tightened by necessity. Units were trained to improvise to fight on minimal supply, but improvisation could not match abundance. Worse still, Allied air superiority severed German logistics at every level. Trains were bombed, bridges destroyed. Fuel convoys attacked. Even when supplies existed, they could not move. German soldiers began to notice the difference on the ground. Allied units rotated fresh equipment. Worn-out vehicles vanished overnight, replaced by new ones. Artillery fire did not taper off, it intensified. Casualties were absorbed without visible strain. To men accustomed to scarcity, it was unsettling. They were not losing to better tactics alone. They were being overwhelmed by a system that did not tire. By late June, German commanders realized something was wrong, not with their soldiers but with their assumptions. The enemy was not merely landing forces. He was constructing permanence. And permanence meant time that Germany no longer had. Because beyond the beaches, the supply machine was only accelerating. The most decisive weapons at Normandy were not tanks or rifles. They were machines without romance. Concrete caissons, floating roadways, steel pontoons, flexible pipelines. The Mulberry harbors assembled under fire transformed open beaches into functioning ports within days. Ships no longer waited for tides or fair weather. Cargo flowed directly onto piers, then onto trucks, then inland, hour after hour, regardless of conditions. When a storm destroyed the American Mulberry at Omaha, the system did not collapse. It adapted. Landing craft were redirected, beach unloading intensified, redundancy absorbed failure. The same principle guided Pluto. Fuel flowed silently beneath the channel, unseen and uncelebrated. No explosions, no heroics. Just pressure, flow, continuity. German planners had invested in visible strength, fortifications, armored divisions, heavy guns. The Allies invested in invisibility. In infrastructure that could not be destroyed easily because it was everywhere at once. This was not technology designed to impress. It was designed to endure. Dwight D. Eisenhower never commanded troops in combat before this war. What he commanded was complexity. His strength lay not in battlefield brilliance but in integration. He understood that modern war was no longer a duel of generals, it was a coordination of systems. Air, land, sea, industry, and politics had to move together. Under Eisenhower, logistics officers held influence rarely seen in previous wars. Decisions were debated not just in terms of enemy reaction, but in terms of throughput. How many tons could move today, tomorrow, next week? General Brehan Somerville, head of the Army Service Forces, embodied this philosophy. He pushed relentlessly for speed, capacity, and scale. Critics accused him of excess. He responded with results. Leadership accepted that mistakes would happen, ships would sink, roads would clog, depots would overflow. The solution was never to slow down. The solution was always to build more capacity. This mindset contrasted sharply with German command culture, which prized precision and control. The American system tolerated disorder because it trusted volume to compensate, control through abundance. Logistics also carried a psychological burden. For Allied soldiers, steady supply meant predictability. Hot meals appeared, ammunition was replenished, wounded were evacuated efficiently. Morale did not depend solely on victory, it depended on continuity. For German soldiers, the opposite was true. They fought knowing replacement was unlikely, that ammunition would run low, that fuel might not arrive. Every engagement consumed resources that could not be replaced. This imbalance shaped behavior. German units grew cautious, conserving strength. Allied units grew confident, knowing losses could be absorbed. It was not that one side valued life more than the other. It was that one side could afford loss and the other could not. This realization settled slowly across the front. A quiet understanding that time favored the side with deeper reserves. That bravery alone could not reverse material reality. By early July, the invasion had passed its most dangerous phase. The beachhead held, supplies flowed faster than they could be consumed. The logistical machine was no longer fragile. It was dominant, and with that dominance came inevitability. The moment was approaching when German resistance would meet the full weight of what had landed behind the lines. By early July 1944, the beaches of Normandy had ceased to be the center of the war. The real struggle had shifted inland, to hedgerows, villages, and narrow roads where movement was slow and visibility limited. German defenses stiffened, counterattacks intensified. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. To many observers, the Allied advance looked bogged down, but beneath the surface, something irreversible was taking shape. Every night, the beaches grew larger, not in territory but in capacity. Supply dumps expanded, fuel tanks multiplied, vehicle parks stretched across fields once used for cattle. Roads were reinforced with steel matting to bear constant traffic. The tonnage figures climbed steadily. By mid-June, Allied forces were landing approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day. By early July, that number had doubled. Ammunition stockpiles reached levels that would have been unthinkable in earlier European wars. German intelligence took note, but could do little to interfere. Allied air power dominated daylight. German movement was restricted to darkness, and even then it was dangerous. Supply convoys were forced to disperse, slowing delivery. Rail lines were cut faster than they could be repaired. In contrast, Allied supply routes grew more resilient by the day. The Cherbourg Peninsula became the next critical objective. The port, heavily fortified and expected to be demolished, fell on June 26 after bitter fighting. As predicted, the Germans destroyed its facilities before retreating. Cranes were wrecked, docks collapsed, channels were mined. In another war, this would have been decisive. Here, it was an inconvenience. American engineers went to work immediately. Mines were cleared, rubble was removed, temporary cranes were installed. Within weeks, Cherbourg began handling cargo again, first slowly, then in growing volume. More importantly, the capture of Cherbourg validated Allied assumptions. Ports would be damaged, beaches would suffice in the meantime. Meanwhile, inland battles continued to grind forward. The bocage favored the defender. German units fought skillfully, inflicting casualties and slowing progress. Tanks struggled in narrow lanes. Infantry cleared hedgerows one field at a time, yet every German success was temporary. When a unit expended ammunition, resupply was uncertain. When a vehicle broke down, replacement was unlikely. When casualties mounted, reinforcements were scarce. For the Allies, the opposite was true. New units rotated in, fresh equipment arrived, artillery fire intensified rather than diminished, fuel shortages were rare. Repairs happened close to the front. The imbalance became stark during German counterattacks. Operations like the attempts to retake Kärnten and later efforts near Caumont revealed a troubling pattern. German forces could still strike, but they could not sustain pressure. Attacks slowed not because of enemy resistance alone, but because fuel and ammunition ran out. The Americans, by contrast, absorbed the blow and replied with overwhelming firepower. This was not brilliance at the point of contact, it was pressure from the rear. By late July, Allied commanders began planning for breakout. Operation Cobra was conceived not as a gamble, but as an exploitation of accumulated weight. Massive air bombardment would shatter German lines. Ground forces would then push through, supported by unprecedented logistical depth. This was the moment when logistics and maneuver finally converged. The beachhead had held. The supply machine was mature. Roads, depots, and pipelines formed a web that stretched from the English factories to the Norman countryside. Germany had hoped to defeat the invasion at the water's edge. That opportunity was gone. Now the question was no longer whether the Allies could be supplied, but whether Germany could withstand what that supply enabled. And as July drew to a close, the answer was about to reveal itself. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944. At precisely timed intervals, Allied bombers appeared overhead in waves. The bombardment was not surgical, it was overwhelming. Thousands of tons of explosives fell on a narrow section of the German front west of St. Lo, pulverizing defensive positions, communication lines, and morale. When the ground assault followed, the effect was immediate. German resistance fractured. This was not simply the result of air power. German units had endured bombardment before. What made Cobra decisive was what followed: the sustained exploitation. American armored columns surged forward, supported by artillery that never lacked shells and vehicles that never ran dry. Behind them, the supply system adjusted in real time. As the front moved, depots moved with it. Temporary fuel points sprang up overnight. Engineers repaired roads under traffic. Convoys rerouted without halting the flow. The logistical machine did not pause to reorganize, it accelerated. Within days, the breakout expanded into a collapse. German units retreated unevenly, attempting to regroup while under constant pressure, but movement required fuel and fuel was scarce. Ammunition shortages worsened. Radios failed, orders arrived too late or not at all. The Allies pushed outward like a flood released from a dam. By August, the scale of supply entering Normandy reached levels that stunned even Allied planners. In the first 100 days after D-Day, more than 2 million tons of supplies had been landed. Alongside them came over 500,000 vehicles and 3 million troops. These numbers were not abstract. They translated directly into momentum. American forces advanced faster than German command could respond. When resistance appeared, it was crushed by artillery concentration. When opportunities opened, they were exploited immediately. There was no need to pause, regroup, or wait for resupply. Germany attempted one final gamble. In early August, Hitler ordered a counteroffensive near Mortain, Operation Luttich. The goal was to cut Allied spearheads and regain the initiative. German units attacked with what armor and fuel they could scrape together. They were stopped within days. Allied air power decimated exposed columns. Ground forces, well supplied and well supported, held firm. The German attack burned through its limited reserves and achieved nothing. This failure sealed the fate of German forces in Normandy. As Allied armies advanced toward the Seine, German units began a chaotic retreat. Vehicles were abandoned. Heavy equipment was destroyed by its own crews to prevent capture. Soldiers marched on foot, hungry and exhausted. The contrast was unmistakable. Allied columns rolled forward with fresh fuel and spare parts. Supply trucks clogged roads behind the front, not with desperation but with excess. Traffic jams formed not from shortages but from abundance. By mid-August, the Falaise pocket closed. German forces trapped inside attempted to escape through narrow corridors under constant attack. Artillery fire was relentless. Airstrikes struck without pause. Those who escaped left behind nearly all heavy equipment. This was not a battle lost in isolation. It was the culmination of logistical defeat. German soldiers fought with courage. Their officers maneuvered skillfully when possible. But courage could not replace fuel. Skill could not substitute ammunition. And improvisation could not overcome an enemy whose supply lines stretched unbroken from factory to front. When Paris was liberated on August 25, the outcome of the campaign was no longer in doubt. The Western Front had reopened, not as a fragile foothold, but as a rolling advance powered by industrial strength. The invasion had not stalled. It had matured. What German planners had mocked as American excess now revealed itself as strategic inevitability. They had prepared to fight divisions. They had not prepared to fight a system capable of delivering an army's weight every day without interruption. And once unleashed, that system could not be stopped at Normandy. It would carry the war across France into Germany itself. By the end of August 1944, the battle for Normandy was over. What remained was devastation and clarity. German losses were staggering. Entire divisions had ceased to exist as fighting units. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Artillery pieces littered roadsides. Supply columns lay burned and broken, victims of air attack and hasty retreat. More damaging than material loss was systemic collapse. The German army in the West no longer functioned as a coordinated force. Communications were fractured. Command structures were improvised. Units that survived did so as fragments, stripped of heavy weapons and dependent on what little could be scavenged. Post-war German reports would later admit what frontline soldiers already knew in August. The defeat in Normandy was not caused by inferior tactics alone. It was caused by logistical impossibility. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge reported that his forces were crippled by fuel shortages and the destruction of transport. Others echoed the same theme. Without rail access, without trucks, without air cover, German maneuver warfare, the very foundation of their doctrine, had become unworkable. In contrast, the Allied situation grew stronger by the day. As ports were repaired and captured, the logistical network expanded further. Cherbourg increased throughput. Additional ports in southern France would soon open following Operation Dragoon. Rail lines were restored with astonishing speed. The flow of supplies into Europe did not slow after Normandy. It accelerated. This abundance allowed Allied commanders to maintain relentless pressure. Units advanced not in cautious steps, but in rolling movements supported by artillery and armor in depth. Even setbacks were temporary. Losses were replaced. Equipment was repaired or exchanged. Perhaps most telling was how quickly Allied planning shifted beyond France. By September, attention turned toward Germany itself. The logistical foundation laid in Normandy made the idea of crossing the Rhine conceivable. What had once seemed a distant goal now appeared inevitable. German leadership, by contrast, faced impossible choices. Fuel shortages forced hard decisions about which units could move and which would remain static. Ammunition rationing became routine. Training collapsed as experienced personnel were lost and could not be replaced. The Western Front no longer resembled the war Germany had prepared for. It had become a struggle against time, material, and a supply system immune to disruption. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers rode a feeling smothered, not by enemy bravery but by enemy persistence. Every retreat was followed immediately by renewed pressure. There was no pause, no breathing space. Allied soldiers sensed it too. Confidence replaced uncertainty. They understood that whatever resistance lay ahead, they would not face it alone. Supplies would come, support would arrive, the system behind them would hold. Normandy proved something that no battlefield demonstration could refute. Modern war was no longer decided solely by tactics or valor. It was decided by who could sustain pressure the longest. And Germany, despite years of battlefield success, could not match the depth of what now confronted it. The implications of that realization would shape warfare long after the guns fell silent. As the front moved eastward, the lessons of Normandy hardened into doctrine. Allied planners studied the campaign not as a single victory, but as a demonstration of a new way to fight. Reports emphasized tonnage figures as much as troop movements. Maps tracked supply corridors alongside enemy positions. Logistics had earned its place beside strategy and tactics. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Between June and September 1944, Allied forces sustained an advance across France faster than any previous army of comparable size. This speed was not achieved through reckless maneuver, but through the ability to support movement continuously. Fuel flowed forward, ammunition followed. Repair units worked inches behind the front. Even when mistakes occurred, overextended advances, traffic congestion, temporary shortages, the system absorbed them. There was always more coming. German post-war analyses reached the same conclusion. Officers writing in captivity repeatedly identified Allied logistics as the decisive factor in the West. The inability to interdict supply at scale, combined with the overwhelming flow of material, rendered German operational skill increasingly irrelevant. No counterstroke could be sustained. No success could be exploited. The war had become asymmetrical, not in courage or competence, but in capacity. This imbalance shaped the final year of the war. When Germany launched its last major offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, it did so by gambling on captured fuel. The plan itself revealed how desperate the situation had become. German strategy no longer revolved around supply, it revolved around theft of the enemy's supply. The gamble failed. Once Allied logistics recovered from initial disruption, the counterattack collapsed under the same weight that had crushed resistance in Normandy. Beyond the battlefield, the Normandy experience reshaped military thinking worldwide. Armies studied the campaign and drew sobering conclusions. Industrial capacity was no longer separate from military power, it was its foundation. Transportation, maintenance, and supply planning were not secondary concerns. They were decisive arms. The United States emerged from the war with a new identity, not just as a military power but as a logistical one. Its ability to project sustained force across oceans would define global strategy for decades. Bases, supply chains, and transport fleets became permanent features of American power, not temporary wartime measures. Normandy marked the moment this reality became undeniable. For Germany, the lesson was harsher. The war it had mastered no longer existed. Speed without supply had limits. Efficiency without depth collapsed under pressure. A system built for short wars could not survive a prolonged struggle against an opponent willing and able to outproduce, outmove, and outlast. The defeat in Normandy was not simply a lost campaign. It was the exposure of a fatal mismatch between doctrine and reality, a mismatch that no amount of bravery could correct. By the time Allied forces reached Germany's borders, the outcome was already decided, not by any single battle, but by a process set in motion on the beaches months earlier. A process measured not in miles gained or enemies killed, but in tons delivered day after day without pause. And it is in that quiet, relentless flow that the true meaning of Normandy finally comes into focus. Normandy is remembered for its courage, for soldiers waiting ashore under fire, for airborne troops scattered in the dark, for hedgerow battles fought field by field, but beneath those images lies a quieter truth. The outcome of the campaign was decided not only by who fought hardest, but by who could continue fighting tomorrow and the day after that without pause. The Germans believed war was won through speed, precision, and discipline. And for a time they were right. Those methods reshaped Europe in months, but they were designed for wars that ended quickly. Normandy revealed a different future. Here, victory belonged to the side that could sustain pressure indefinitely. That could replace losses without slowing. That could turn factories, ports, roads, and schedules into weapons as decisive as tanks or guns. American logistics were not glamorous. They were heavy, inelegant, excessive, and unstoppable. 2 million tons of supplies landing in 100 days was not a statistic. It was a verdict. A declaration that modern war had crossed a threshold where industrial endurance outweighed battlefield brilliance. This did not diminish the sacrifice of those who fought. It explained it. Every advance inland was supported by unseen hands far behind the lines. Every artillery barrage, every repaired vehicle, every hot meal delivered under fire was part of a chain that began far from Normandy and never broke. After 1944, no major army could afford to ignore this lesson. Wars would still be fought by soldiers. They would still be decided by blood and courage. But they would be shaped inevitably by logistics. By who could move the most, fix the fastest, and sustain the longest. On the beaches of Normandy, Germany did not just lose ground. It lost the future of warfare to a system it had never believed possible. And once that system stepped onto the continent, history moved with it.